There's something haunting about places that time forgot, abandoned towns, eerie ruins, and the unsettling silence that fills their empty streets. Ghost towns carry stories of the past, whispers of those who once lived there, and sometimes, traces of something far darker. Tonight, I'll share stories of explorers who dared to venture into these forgotten places, only to find they were not as empty as they seemed. These are encounters with the unknown in ghost towns. Happening number 1, the last visit to Haven Ridge. Ghost towns always fascinated me. The eerie silence, decaying buildings, and the sense that time had stopped make them feel like windows into the past. One such town, Haven Ridge, had been on my radar for years. It was abandoned in the late 1950s after the local coal mine collapsed, claiming dozens of lives. Stories of hauntings circulated, but they only added to its allure. Last summer, my friend Carter and I decided to finally visit. Armed with flashlights, a camera, and plenty of water, we arrived just before sunset. The town was nestled in a valley, surrounded by dense forest. As we approached, the first thing we noticed was the stillness: no birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence. The main street was lined with rotting wooden buildings. There was a general store, a schoolhouse, and a church with a crumbling steeple. We decided to explore the schoolhouse first. The floorboards creaked under our weight, and our flashlights illuminated broken desks and a blackboard covered in illegible chalk marks. Then we heard it, a faint sound of children laughing. Carter and I froze. The laughter echoed faintly, as if coming from a distance, yet we were the only ones there. "Must be the wind," Carter said, trying to sound confident. But we both knew there was no wind. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the town in shadow. We moved to the church next. Its interior was eerier than the schoolhouse, with broken pews and a pulpit covered in dust. As we stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind us. Carter and I spun around, but no one was there. The air inside felt colder than outside, and the faint sound of organ music began to play. "This is a prank," Carter whispered, though his voice trembled. The music grew louder, and then we heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from the loft above. We shone our flashlights, but the loft was empty. Suddenly, something heavy fell from the loft, crashing onto the pulpit. It was a Bible, its pages yellowed and brittle. Carter picked it up, and as he did, a deep voice boomed, "Leave." We didn't hesitate. Running out of the church, we nearly tripped over ourselves in the dark. As we sprinted toward our car, I glanced back. Standing in the church doorway was a shadowy figure, tall and motionless, watching us. When we finally reached the car and sped away, we didn't speak for several minutes. It wasn't until we were miles away that Carter broke the silence. "We're never going back there." I agreed. That was my first and last visit to Haven Ridge. Even now, I can't explain what happened, but I've learned one thing: some places are abandoned for a reason. Happening number 2, Echoes in Black Hollow. Black Hollow is a place I wouldn't have visited if I'd known what I know now. It's a ghost town buried deep in the mountains, long forgotten after a mining company went bankrupt in the 1930s. Locals claim it's cursed. Stories about disappearances and strange occurrences kept most people away. But for me, those stories made it irresistible. One fall afternoon, I convinced my brother Mark to join me on an overnight trip to Black Hollow. We packed light, camping gear, flashlights, and a map downloaded from a sketchy website. By the time we reached the dirt path leading into the hollow, the sun was already sinking behind the mountains. The town came into view as we rounded a bend. It was smaller than I expected, just a few dilapidated buildings surrounded by overgrown brush. A well sat in the center, its wooden cover cracked and sagging. The air felt heavy, like a thunderstorm was about to break, though the sky was clear. We set up camp near what looked like an old tavern. Its sign, barely hanging by a nail, creaked in the breeze. Mark suggested we explore before it got too dark, so we started with the tavern. Inside, the walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper, and the floor was littered with broken bottles and debris. That's when we heard it, a faint whisper, like someone talking just out of earshot. Mark froze. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, scanning the room with my flashlight. There was no one there. We followed the sound outside, toward the well. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like someone repeating the same phrase over and over, but we couldn't make out the words. Mark leaned over the edge of the well and shone his flashlight down. The beam revealed nothing but darkness. Suddenly, a hand, pale and skeletal, grasped the edge of the well. Mark screamed and fell backward. I grabbed him, and we both scrambled away. The hand disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the whispers didn't stop. They were louder now, surrounding us, coming from every direction. We bolted back to our campsite, but something was wrong. Our tent, which we'd left zipped up, was now wide open, and our gear was scattered. In the distance, we saw shadows moving between the buildings. They were tall, humanoid, but their movements were unnatural, jerky, like puppets on strings. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice shaking. I didn't argue. As we packed up as quickly as we could, the shadows seemed to grow closer. The whispers had become guttural chants, and the air around us felt electric, like we were being watched from all sides. We ran back to the car, stumbling over roots and rocks in our panic. When we finally reached it, Mark fumbled with the keys, but as soon as the engine roared to life, the chanting stopped. Driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The shadows were standing in the middle of the road, watching us leave. That night, Mark and I didn't sleep. The sound of those whispers still echoes in my mind, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. Black Hollow is a place I'll never return to. Some ghost towns are better left alone. Happening number 3, Shadows of Silver Vale. Silver Vale was a town I hadn't even heard of until I stumbled upon a forum about abandoned places. Located somewhere in the high desert, it was once a booming silver mining settlement. According to locals, the mine shut down after a series of mysterious deaths, and the residents fled soon after. The town has been sitting empty for nearly a century, but visitors report feeling an unshakable sense of being watched. Naturally, this piqued my curiosity. I convinced my 2 friends, Nate and Lily, to join me on a weekend trip. It took hours to reach Silver Vale, following poorly marked dirt roads that wound through the barren landscape. By the time we arrived, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the dilapidated structures. The town was a ghost of its former self. Buildings leaned precariously, their roofs caved in, and rusted tools were scattered around as if the workers had simply vanished. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the dry earth. We decided to explore the mine first. The entrance was partially collapsed, but we managed to squeeze through. Inside, the air was cool and damp, and the smell of earth and rust filled our noses. Our flashlights illuminated old tracks and mining equipment, long abandoned. Then, we saw it, a figure standing in the distance, just beyond the reach of our lights. "Nate, did you see that?" Lily whispered, clutching his arm. The figure didn't move. It was human-shaped but too still, too rigid. Nate called out, but there was no response. As we stepped closer, it disappeared into the darkness, as if it had never been there. Suddenly, a loud clanging sound echoed through the tunnel, like metal striking metal. It came from deeper within the mine, but we couldn't see anything. "Let's get out of here," Lily said, her voice trembling. None of us argued. Back in the open air, we decided to check out the town's saloon. The building was surprisingly intact, with faded posters still tacked to the walls and broken bottles littering the bar. As we wandered through, we found an old piano in the corner. Its keys were dusty, and some were missing altogether. As we turned to leave, a single note rang out. We froze, staring at the piano. It was impossible, none of us had touched it. Nate moved closer to inspect it, but before he could, the piano played another note, followed by several more, as if an invisible hand was pressing the keys. That was the breaking point for Lily. "We're leaving." Now, as we walked back to the car, we noticed something chilling: footprints in the dust. They weren't ours, and they led from the saloon toward the church at the edge of town. The church was the only building we hadn't explored, and it loomed in the distance like a dark sentinel. Against Lily's protests, Nate and I decided to take a quick look inside. The door creaked as we pushed it open, revealing rows of pews covered in cobwebs. At the front of the church stood a large wooden cross, and beneath it, a figure knelt, its head bowed. "Nate, let's go," I whispered, but he was already stepping closer. "Hello," he called out. The figure raised its head, revealing hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Its mouth moved, but no sound came out. Suddenly, the church bell rang, loud and jarring, even though the steeple had no bell visible from the outside. We didn't stick around to find out more. We sprinted back to the car, not looking back. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood in the middle of the road, watching us leave, its grin illuminated by the taillights. That night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of that face haunted me, and I kept hearing the piano notes and the church bell in my head. Silver Vale may be a ghost town, but someone is still there, and it's not resting peacefully. Happening number 4, the forgotten streets of Dry Hollow. Dry Hollow wasn't marked on any map I could find. I first heard about it from an old hiking buddy who mentioned the place in passing, claiming it was cursed. The town was supposedly abandoned in the 1920s after a drought destroyed its crops and left its residents destitute. Yet, whispers of strange disappearances and shadowy figures in the area had persisted over the years. One weekend, I decided to find Dry Hollow for myself. After hours of navigating winding roads and using GPS coordinates shared on an obscure forum, I finally arrived. The sun was low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the surrounding desert. The town consisted of crumbling brick buildings, weathered wooden homes, and a single dirt road that ran straight through its center. The first thing that struck me was the absolute silence. No wind, no birds, nothing but the sound of my own footsteps. I parked my car near what appeared to be the town's general store and stepped inside. Dust covered everything, from the empty shelves to the old cash register. Faded posters and handwritten notes were tacked to a bulletin board on the wall, but most were illegible. As I wandered further into the store, I heard a faint creaking noise. I froze, listening. It sounded like footsteps above me, slow and deliberate. The second floor of the building had partially collapsed, and there was no way anyone could safely walk up there. Still, the sound continued, each step louder than the last. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the back of the store. I spun around to see a wooden shelf toppled over, though I was the only one there. My heart pounded as I backed out of the store, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Determined to shake off the nerves, I decided to explore another building, a house that looked better preserved than the others. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open to find a living room frozen in time. A dusty armchair faced a cold fireplace, and framed photographs hung crookedly on the walls. As I inspected one of the photographs, a family portrait, the room grew noticeably colder. I felt a presence behind me, like someone was watching. Turning around, I saw nothing, but the chair in front of the fireplace began to rock slowly back and forth, as if someone had just stood up from it. Panicking, I backed out of the house and stumbled into the street. That's when I saw them. Figures stood in the windows of nearly every building, their faces obscured by shadow. They didn't move, didn't react, just stared. As I turned to run back to my car, I felt the ground beneath me tremble, and the faint sound of whispers filled the air. I jumped into my car and started the engine, but as I looked into the rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing directly behind me. Its face was pale, and its eyes were hollow black pits. It raised one hand, as if to wave goodbye, and then it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from Dry Hollow. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but one thing is clear, that town is far from empty. Something lingers there, and whatever it is, it doesn't want to be disturbed.